Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. This is the 14th episode of the Latham & Watkins Drug Pricing Series. I'm Chris Schott, a partner in the healthcare and life sciences practice in our Washington, D.C. office. I focus my practice on all things market access, and that includes manufacturer compliance related to the Medicaid Drug Rebate Program, Medicare Parts B and D, and the 340B Drug Pricing Program, as well as, of course, implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Joining me today are two partners from our Washington, D.C. office, Jennifer Bragg and Bill McConagha. Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Chris. I'm Jennifer Bragg, a partner in Latham's Washington, D.C. office in the FDA practice. My practice involves advising life sciences companies on complex regulatory matters, and also in investigations led by DOJ, FDA, and state attorneys general. I also advise companies on compliance program issues, whether it's a company that's developing or enhancing its compliance program, or a situation where the company or even its board wants to assess the rigor of its compliance program.
Thanks, Jennifer. Happy to be here, Chris. I am Bill McConagha. I, too, am a life sciences partner here in Latham's healthcare and life sciences practice. I focus on FDA issues. My practice covers regulatory matters and FDA compliance and administrative enforcement. I cover the full life cycle of FDA products from pre-market to post-market oversight. I worked at FDA for 17 years in a variety of capacities before joining private practice. I began as an attorney in the Office of Chief Counsel, eventually became an assistant commissioner, and worked for a time as a health policy advisor in the Senate Help Committee, which, as many of you know, is the committee of jurisdiction over FDA in the U.S. Senate.
Great. Thank you so much. Happy to have you both on the podcast today. In each episode, we focus on a specific topic that is relevant to drug pricing or the pharmaceutical industry or the healthcare industry more broadly. And after discussing the substance, we ask the question, which Olympic sport is it like? And we have the list of Olympic sports here to see which most resembles the topic in terms of strategy, complexity, or frankly, level of conflict. Today, we'll talk about updates regarding FDA life sciences enforcement trends, including a look ahead. Latham recently also published a webcast on this topic, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Maybe we can start by introducing the topic a little bit. Jennifer, can you give us a brief overview of the FDA enforcement landscape?
Happy to, Chris. As many of our listeners know, FDA is a public health agency, and its primary mission is to protect the public health. And so it's not surprising that FDA tends to focus its enforcement resources on conduct that presents a risk of patient harm. This is not something we expect to differ regardless of administration. What that means is that FDA tends to focus its enforcement resources in situations where there is an increased threat to the public. Sometimes that means products that have a box warning, maybe they have a REMS, or maybe products that are utilized by a vulnerable patient population. To the extent that your company markets products such as these, you probably have already noticed and can continue to expect that they will receive more scrutiny from FDA. Additionally, we expect FDA to continue to focus on compliance with GMP and pharmacovigilance requirements, and Bill will talk about that in a bit. Things like patient harm, flouting of FDA's regulatory authority, or repeat misconduct tend to be aggravating factors that are often present when FDA partners with DOJ to take more serious action against companies. Finally, I think it's worth just mentioning, as we're setting the stage, that FDA is and really continues to be stretched from a resource perspective. This is not something we expect to change, as there are increased demands on agency personnel's time, and the FDA is also facing a risk of a great deal of retirements by longstanding employees.
Thanks, Jennifer, for setting the stage. So clearly we're dealing here with issues for companies with products on the market. I'll just mention briefly from the drug pricing angle, if you have a product and you're getting ready for FDA approval, don't forget to pay attention to some FDA-related things about your drug that you're setting up, like NDC numbers, which can have a big impact later on drug pricing. Bill, now that we have this background here about the FDA enforcement approaches, how active is the FDA's inspection program? Have the inspection rates returned to pre-COVID levels?
Thanks, Chris. Good question. It does appear that FDA's inspection rates are beginning to normalize as we all emerge from COVID. At the height of COVID in FY 2021, there were about 6,800 inspections. And that number climbed in FOI 2022 to about 11,000, then 14,000 in 2023, and it dipped slightly in FOI 2024 to about 11,500. So I think it's fair to say that we're out of COVID, that the agency is active. The numbers have kind of normalized. It's interesting. This slight dip from 23 to 24 really reflects a reduction in the number of domestic establishment inspections. The number of foreign inspections has been fairly steady in recent years, and that's not surprising given the increasingly global economy and supply chain and all the focus on it. I would expect, though, that those numbers would actually increase as it relates to foreign inspections, just given that enhanced focus. I will also say that what's kind of interesting in digging into the numbers in preparation for this podcast is that the inspection classifications that we see as what's called official action indicated are actually slightly down over the last couple of years, from about 3.5% of total inspections down to about 2%. And for our listeners who are not familiar with the classification distinctions, when FDA does an inspection of an establishment, it will classify that inspection one of three ways. The first and the most benign would be to say that it is no action indicated, or NAI. Most inspections are what are called voluntary action indicated, VAI, and that's where FDA leaves an establishment with a list of observations that it's confident the establishment will kind of voluntarily correct on its own and that FDA can verify at its next visit. The highest classification is what's called OAI, or official action indicated, and that is when there is a serious enough issue that FDA is concerned it might lead to something, say, like a warning letter or a judicial action. We'll talk more about those in a few moments. But what's noteworthy when you look at these numbers is that the percentage of OAI classification as an overall rate in terms of inspections, as I say, is about 2%. And the fact that it's dipped a little bit does not strike me as meaningful on its face. But I would say that I think the percentage is lower than one would expect, given how much all of us who operate in this space and are on these podcasts and do these enforcement webinars focus on those situations where companies get into real trouble. And what these statistics show us is that the vast, vast majority of establishment inspections end without really serious consequence.
Great to have that put in perspective and to understand the framework of these different levels here. Maybe we talk about another level, which is investigations. Jennifer, it can sometimes be hard to understand why some FDA investigations end up resolving civilly while others include a criminal component. Is there a rule of thumb for making sense of these cases and how they sort out?
Well, Chris, you're setting me up to give a lawyer's favorite answer, which of course is it depends. Seriously, though, a lot has to do with several things. Some of the smaller things you can think about and ask yourself is, how did the case come in to DOJ? Did it come in through sort of a civil route via a qui tam, in which case it's more likely to be sort of on that civil track? Did it come in through a complaint by an individual or perhaps through a referral by the agency, which can sometimes mean it begins with a criminal track? In my experience, it can be very hard to change the track of a case once it has come in a certain way. And so sometimes it's as simple as, how did the case come to the government in terms of trying to understand why a case is being investigated civilly or criminally? The other thing, of course, is that the facts do matter. And as I mentioned earlier, things such as evidence of patient harm, an indication that a company or individuals have been trying to flout FDA's regulatory authority, or an indication that a company has engaged in repeat misconduct are aggravating factors and tend to be present in cases that are resolved criminally. I will say that DOJ seems to have been more careful and more choosy about which cases it insists on resolving criminally. And I would say that's a trend over the last 10 years or so. And I think in part, it's a realization that corrections and punishments can be effectively meted out even in the absence of a criminal resolution. I think it's also a recognition that criminal resolutions can come with their own collateral complications, particularly because HHS OIG has exclusion authority, some of it mandatory, some of it permissive, that come into play when there is a criminal resolution. And this can make trying to resolve a case much more complex and difficult, both for the government and for the company. And so I think the facts will matter in terms of whether a case comes in on a civil track or a criminal track. But most of all, the underlying sort of conduct or misconduct is what is going to be the most important thing that drives whether a case ends up as civil or criminal. And if you go beyond the press release in these settlements and you really go into the documents, the pleadings and the like, it's a good opportunity to understand just what those underlying facts are that seem to drive the resolution. And sometimes that can be a good way to understand why a case ended up where it did.
Well, it sounds like there's some aspects of this where we would not have control how the case arose, but other areas where we may have some control. So it definitely sounds that the advice of knowledgeable professionals is extremely important if you find yourself in this situation. Bill, let's talk a little about the civil side here. How active have FDA and DOJ been on FDA-related civil injunctions? What do you see in terms of trends or takeaways in that area?
Good question. How active? So in FY 2024, FDA through the Department of Justice initiated just 4 civil injunctions and 0 product seizures. And to my knowledge, there's just 1 that's been initiated in FY 2025. And all of those related to food or cosmetics, not to human medical products. So we have to go back to FY 2023 to find injunctions that involve human medical products, in this case, human drugs. There were 5 injunctions in FY 2023, at least 3 of them by my count involve human drugs. And what we can see there and glean from this is that all 3 of them were GMP cases, allegations of pervasive violation of GMP. And to build on some of the comments that Jennifer just made, all 3 of them were situations in which the companies, I should say, were seen as kind of repeat offenders. So there were multiple FDA inspections, multiple OAI determinations, FDA inspections that in some instances, classified observations as repeat observations. And there was a sense that failures to correct the problems once initially identified were the reasons for the escalation. And this idea that, companies may well have an opportunity in the early going to right the ship. But if they are seen as failing to take appropriate action, that's a time when the government will actually marshal the resources to intercede and actually initiate a civil injunction. And so the fact patterns in all of these cases, and I'll name the companies, Pharmasol, LGM Pharma, and Qualgen. Qualgen was in the pharmacy compounding space, but similar fact pattern as it relates to GMP. All of these are instructive, and a reminder to all of us that if you get a warning letter or a very serious 483 at an establishment inspection, it's time to lean into those issues and correct them before matters escalate. I think the reason we see the overall numbers as relatively low is that FDA will typically use a warning letter and the OAI classification as kind of an administrative enforcement tool to compel the sort of corrective actions that did not take place with these 3 companies. And that's why most situations get resolved short of a civil action.
I think that's a great point, Bill. And I think, that's something that has changed in the last decade or so, where we've seen FDA impose additional requests. They're posed as requests, although they really feel a lot like requirements within warning letters, things that look an awful lot like requirements that would have been imposed in consent decrees in times past, things like having additional auditors come in and provide reports to FDA. And so it seems like FDA has been able to get a little bit of what it used to get only by doing a consent decree in the form of making those requirements part of warning letters.
Yeah, to add to that, it's a great point. You actually see in FDA's warning letters now, and I've seen this in the past 2.5, 3 years, they will actually explicitly call for companies to hire consultants. And it has long been a standard practice in the industry, but it is interesting to see FDA expressly calling for it in the warning letter.
So you mentioned the importance of warning letters, and yet my understanding is that there's been a relative low number of them related to product promotion issues from the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and specifically the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion, as well as the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So, Jennifer, how should we interpret this relative dearth of warning letters from the agency?
It is an interesting trend, Chris. And when we say a relative dearth, again, I'm looking over sort of a 15-year arc as opposed to the last 2 or 3 years. I guess that's a sign of my age. But the reality in the promotional space is that I believe FDA's scaling back of its issuance of warning letters is directly traceable to a series of pretty significant losses that DOJ and FDA sustained in the First Amendment space between 2012 and 2016, where companies in some cases and individuals in others challenged FDA's interpretation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the way in which it was enforcing such things. And I think that the losses in those cases have caused FDA to be much more thoughtful and careful about the way it enforces promotional activity, such that it is much more focused now on promotional activity that it believes is false or misleading, which is the language that is directly tracked back to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and really does focus on those things as opposed to going farther abroad in warning letters or in untitled letters that it brings. To its credit, the FDA has at that same time been working very hard to develop and to issue guidance that is intended to educate companies with respect to its views of what the promotional rules of the road are, and trying to sort of fill in the blanks in places where there were gray spaces and companies really didn't know how to interpret what was permissible and what hasn't. And so FDA has issued, now close to 10 guidance documents over the last 10 years on various promotional issues that I think have been very, very well received to the extent that they have provided clarity to companies. The hope is that that's also been useful in helping companies produce promotional materials that are more compliant from FDA's point of view. But for whatever the reason, the number of letters has gone down substantially. I took a quick look before this podcast, and back in 2010, OPDP, which was then called DDMAC, issued 50-something warning letters in 1 year. And so far in 2024, they have not issued a single warning letter. They have issued several untitled letters, but they haven't issued a single warning letter. And those numbers are consistent with the issuance over the past few years. So I think there's no question that the number of promotional letters are down, but I do think it's a combination of FDA being more targeted about what it is focused on as misconduct, and also giving companies a better opportunity to be compliant by issuing guidance that has been very helpful.
And I just might add a point, if I may, here, because Jennifer very thoughtfully just described why the warning letters are down on promotional issues. But, one question is, if we look more broadly at warning letters directed to, human medical product companies, are they down overall? And they are slightly, but not as dramatically as the promotion letters. And we see that in FY 2024, FDA issued about 13,300 warning letters, and almost 13,000 of those went to tobacco companies or retailers. So the numbers that actually impacted human medical products were much lower. I think the numbers in my digging on the FDA website were 163 warning letters on drugs in FY 2024, 41 on devices, and 15 on biologics. And not surprisingly, most of those dealt with violations of GMP, alleged violations of GMP, or the quality system regulation, which is essentially, as you know, GMP for medical devices. There was also a fair amount of focus, as one might expect, on manufacturers ex-US, and key areas of focus were China and India, as well as Mexico and Canada here in North America. And interesting trends that we see in the warning letters for the human medical products outside of the promotional context are a real focus on process validation and production controls, focus on supplier qualification, and we continue to see an interest in data integrity and lab controls, especially in biologics and drug companies. And that is a trend we've seen for the last decade, and I think it persists.
Yeah, so I think we've talked now about enforcement, enforcement mechanisms. We've talked about guidance and warning letters. And Jennifer, you mentioned litigation against the agency in this context. So maybe we turn now to the broader legal environment that the FDA is operating in. And of course, one highlight in the landscape generally vis-a-vis federal agencies is the recent Loper-Bright decision, which overturned the long-standing Chevron deference. And as listeners of this podcast know, we've talked about this extensively in one podcast episode devoted entirely to Loper-Bright. So here in the FDA context, Bill, let's start with you. How do you think the demise of the Chevron deference will impact the FDA enforcement activity, if at all?
It's a good question, and there's a fair amount of conjecture here, but I guess I'll say the following. It's an important decision, but I don't think that it is going to mean all business as usual stops at FDA. And so my own view, and I welcome Jennifer's thoughts on this as well, is that I don't think FDA is likely to slow core enforcement activities that are grounded in years of precedent and behavior. So like the FDA establishment inspections that we talked about, the GMP violations, allegations thereof that I just referenced, allegations related to unapproved new drugs or clinical trial fraud, I think the FDA will continue to feel empowered in making those allegations. I think where Loper has an impact is in enforcement activities that relate to less developed or maybe more controversial areas of law. So this would be the approval standards in the Tobacco Act, which are still being developed, if you will, certainly reviewed by the courts. There's been much made of FDA's effort to regulate laboratory-developed tests under its new rulemaking, which is currently being challenged in court. I expect that Loper-Bright will be invoked in that litigation. It'll be very interesting to see how it resolves. I think this is something of a bellwether or kind of a harbinger, if you will, for how this will be used moving forward. Areas where there is a statutory distinction drawn between a carve-out, if you will, recently with respect to FDA jurisdiction may also be an area where you see slowed enforcement. So I'm thinking about the lines between wellness products and medical devices, efforts to regulate artificial intelligence. I think those sorts of areas, FDA, in light of Loper-Bright, is going to have to be incredibly deliberate in terms of developing its administrative record. And so I think it slows those efforts, but I don't think it stops them. And I will note, for whatever it's worth, that Chevron has really avoided Chevron fights in recent years. I'm not sure that it's actually defended on Chevron during this administration. But look, statutory questions, this notion of statutory interpretation, it pervades virtually everything the agency does. And so I do expect that Loper-Bright will cause a slowdown in some of these more controversial or new areas while FDA develops a record in support of what it's going to do.
And Bill, you've addressed some of the other questions I had for you in terms of other takeaways or trends. Is there anything else we should be looking out for in the new year in terms of trends or takeaways from the FDA?
Well, I think we're all interested to see what's going to happen with the new administration. And I think we all recognize that, at least if we take them at their word, there's going to be a fair amount of focus on vaccines, a fair amount of focus on food additives. And I also will be interested to see how they address the LDT rule. And so we'll be watching that closely. As it relates to kind of day-to-day enforcement, I expect FDA to continue to use administrative tools like warning letters and import alerts to enforce the FDCA in the first instance. And so this builds on some of the comments that Jennifer was making. The agency regulates an enormous chunk of the economy. It's a relatively small agency, given the scope of work it has to do, and it fairly effectively uses these administrative tools like warning letters and import alerts in the first instance to kind of shape behavior and correct what it perceives as violations of law. And so I think we'll see that continue. I'll note that the complexity of the global supply chain remains a challenge for FDA, both in terms of its inspections and enforcement generally, but also in terms of shortage issues. And there's been an enormous amount of energy, devoted to the discussion of shortage issues and FDA's role in both precipitating and preventing them. And I think at times FDA has been kind of unfairly accused of misconduct there. But in any event, I think they're mindful of the need to be thoughtful about those issues in the enforcement context. Jennifer touched on the First Amendment jurisprudence. and how it's translated into fewer actions in relation to promotional activity. I expect that to continue. With respect to FDA establishment inspections, I expect them to continue with business as usual. I just made reference to this a few moments ago. I expect them to continue to, especially for medical products companies, enforce against GMP and QSR and routine inspections. And a clear takeaway from all of us, based on the discussion we just had about the criminal cases and the civil cases, is that when you get a 43 that alleges violations of GMP, remediation is essential. We urge you to lean into it and reach out to us if we can be helpful. And we expect FDA to increase focus on certain areas. I expect an increased amount of activity in stem cell therapies. And I have a hunch that we're going to see a lot of action around design controls for complex medical devices. So that's what I have my eyes on in 2025. We've talked a little bit, actually quite a bit, about human medical products here, but let's not lose sight of tobacco and foods, which I think will also be, a continued major focus of the agency from a regulatory and enforcement perspective.
And maybe, Bill, if I can just build on
Please.
to one of your very good points there, which is, talking about establishment inspections. I would not be surprised to see the incoming Trump administration actually prioritize oversight of manufacturing facilities outside of the U.S. This would be consistent with his long-held view of the importance of encouraging companies to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And many in the industry have long believed that companies with foreign manufacturing establishments enjoy something of an advantage over facilities located in the U.S. This is because, of course, the frequency of inspecting facilities outside of the U.S. is lower than those locations here in the U.S., and also because, for a number of logistical reasons, foreign inspections are almost always announced in advance, which can provide an advantage in terms of allowing a site to prepare for FDA's inspection. So one thing I'm watching to see here is whether the Trump FDA will seek to encourage companies to set up U.S. manufacturing operations by increasing the scrutiny of foreign establishments through its inspection authority.
That's a really good thought. And what's really interesting about that is if one wanted to effectuate change administratively, as I'm sure all the listeners know, products that are imported into the United States from outside the U.S. that are subject to FDA regulation are subject to import alerts and detention without physical examination at ports of entry. And so this is kind of an enormously important tool. It amounts to a de facto injunction. Essentially, FDA can keep a product out of the United States if it appears to violate the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That appearance standard is not a particularly high standard. FDA just has to articulate a way in which the product appears adulterated or misbranded. And there's no kind of due process in the sense that there is kind of no court hearing. Now, look, a company that feels aggrieved or mistreated certainly can go to court to challenge FDA's decision, but it's an enormously powerful tool for FDA. And, we can cite a recent example. So as you may recall, in the last year, FDA put several Chinese manufacturers of syringes on an import alert, which obviously was very unwelcome for those companies in China and, the manufacturers in the United States who relied on those imports. And so I do see the point you're making, Jennifer, when you kind of combine that with the ease of the administrative enforcement in kind of blocking the U.S. market to these ex-U.S. manufacturers, there's a real opportunity for action there, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next year.
Well, it sounds like in this area, as in all of healthcare in the U.S., we are in for an exciting ride. And I think that takes us, after having covered this topic in some detail, to the question we asked at the outset. Which Olympic sport is it like? So, Jennifer, do you want to start and tell us which sport you've picked?
I am desperate to go first here, Chris, because I have the perfect sport, and it is women's gymnastics. And the reason I chose women's gymnastics is that both China and the U.S. are heavy hitters in drug manufacturing. They are also heavy hitters in gymnastics. And similarly as well, gymnastics has lots of rules. Lots of nitpicking by judges on technical issues, and sounds like a perfect parallel to FDA inspections.
Excellent. Not to mention that sometimes things seem to be arbitrary, but we'll pause on that. Bill, what have you picked?
Wow, that is much more thoughtful than the sport I'm picking. I'm going to go with, in light of that, I'm going to go in a totally different direction. I'm going to go with the biathlon, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is the sport where you do cross-country skiing and then you shoot. I'm going to go with it for these reasons. It's multifaceted. It's complex. It's a little bit weird. And it is a sport where there are moments of intense physical exertion replaced by a desperate need to catch your breath. So that's what I'm going with.
That's very, very nice comparison. The need to run and then be completely still to shoot at the target. Yep, that's very smart. Look, I'm much less advanced here today. I'm going to pick beach volleyball, and in part I picked that because it is such a cold day today. But there's another reason. Beach volleyball, it's only 2 people on each team, but they really have to communicate very well and almost intuitively be connected with each other to have strategies and have the plays. And it sounds like we need that here as well inside the companies with the different areas where we need to have real coordination in all the different aspects of how we do the business to make sure that we stay within the guardrails, and if there's a problem that we can quickly address it. So I think that wraps up our podcast. Don't know about you two, but I'm definitely ready for some good food. So where are we going for the after party? Jennifer, what do you recommend?
Chris, the after party is going to be at a Washington establishment classic this year. It's going to be at the Bombay Club, which is one of my favorite restaurants in town. It serves great Indian food, has very refined service in what I would deem a classic environment. So after party at the Bombay Club.
Refined service. That's beautifully said.
My other job is being a restaurant critic.
Sounds excellent. It seems like we've picked the right guest today to guide us to a good after-party location. Thanks to our guests for joining the podcast today. We'll put a link to the webcast that further explores the FDA enforcement landscape and trends into the show notes. And thank you to our listeners for checking out the Latham & Watkins drug pricing series, which is part of our Connected with Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
Thanks, Chris. It was fun being here with you today.
Thanks so much, Chris. It was a pleasure to be here.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins, LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins, LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins, LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York,